People keep asking the same question, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in bold claims, sometimes with absolute certainty. Were the Watchers just the Anunnaki by another name? This idea refuses to fade. It appears in documentaries, comment sections, late-night podcasts, and glossy book covers, promising hidden history. The claim sounds simple. Ancient beings came from the sky, taught humans knowledge, ruled for a time, then vanished. Different cultures remembered them differently, or so the argument goes, but history is rarely that neat. The reason this question will not die is not because the evidence keeps changing, but because the idea scratches a deep human itch. It promises one secret behind many mysteries. It suggests that scattered ancient stories are pieces of one lost truth waiting to be reassembled. That promise is powerful, especially in an age flooded with information but starved for meaning. To understand why the Watchers and the Anunnaki keep getting fused together, we have to step back and look at where the question comes from, not where people want it to go. The Watchers emerge from Jewish texts written during the Second Temple period, roughly between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after. They are not casual myths. They are part of a moral explanation for why the world went wrong. In these writings, heavenly beings are assigned roles, boundaries, and rules. The Watchers break those rules, and the consequences are severe. The Anunnaki come from a very different world. They appear in Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian texts that stretch back to the 3rd millennium before Christ. These are gods within a polytheistic system. They are not rebels against heaven. They are heaven, acting within a divine hierarchy that governs fate, kingship, and the order of the cosmos. On the surface, both groups are powerful and connected to the sky. That surface similarity is where the modern fusion begins. In the 20th century, ancient texts became widely available in translation. At the same time, science fiction reshaped how people imagined the past. Gods slowly became misunderstood as advanced beings. Heaven turned into outer space. Symbols were read as machines. Within this climate, the name Anunnaki was lifted from clay tablets and dropped into a new story about ancient visitors. Later, the Watchers were pulled into the same orbit. The internet accelerated this process. Claims spread faster than context. Quotes lost their footnotes. Differences were smoothed over to keep the theory clean and exciting. The result is a question that sounds historical, but is actually modern. Were the Watchers just the Anunnaki rebranded? It feels like a challenge to scholars and a revelation to everyone else. But history does not work by feeling. It works by sources, language, genre, and time. This chapter begins the slow work of separating ancient belief from modern desire, not to take away wonder, but to replace confusion with clarity. Because the real story of these beings is not smaller than the myth. It is far more interesting today. The confusion begins with names that sound similar only when stripped of their worlds. Watchers and Anunnaki are often spoken as if they occupy the same shelf of history, but they come from different civilizations, different centuries, and different purposes. The Watchers belong to Jewish apocalyptic thought, a tradition shaped by exile, empire, and the struggle to explain evil without surrendering belief in a just God. The Anunnaki belong to Mesopotamian religion, a system that never asked the same moral questions and never aimed to answer them. When these two are treated as one, context collapses and meaning follows. The Watchers emerge from texts written during the Second Temple period, roughly between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after. These writings reflect a world under foreign rule, first Persian, then Greek, then Roman. Jewish thinkers were asking why suffering existed and how divine justice could still operate. Apocalyptic literature offered answers through visions, angels, judgment, and cosmic rebellion. In this framework, the Watchers are not gods. They are subordinate heavenly beings who fail their assignment. Their story explains corruption, violence, and why the flood was necessary in moral terms. The Anunnaki come from a much older setting. Their name appears in Sumerian sources from the 3rd millennium before Christ and continues through Akkadian and Babylonian traditions. These texts describe a pantheon of gods tied to natural forces, kingship, and the structure of the universe. The Anunnaki are not rebels, they are authorities. They participate in assemblies, decide fates, and uphold cosmic order. There is no final judgment awaiting them, no moral failure that explains human sin. Their world assumes many gods with competing interests, not one god enforcing ethical law. Genre matters here more than imagery. Jewish apocalyptic texts are meant to warn, correct, and prepare readers for divine intervention. They are deeply moral and future-focused. Mesopotamian myths are explanatory and ritual-based. They explain why kings rule, why cities prosper, and how humans serve the gods. Similar language about heaven or descent does not mean shared identity. It means shared human attempts to understand power and origin using familiar symbols. The problem begins when modern readers flatten these differences. When Watchers are treated as ancient astronauts, their role as moral caution is erased. When Anunnaki are treated as fallen angels, their place within polytheism is misunderstood. The two names survive today in the same conversations, not because ancient writers linked them, but because modern audiences want a single hidden story behind all traditions. History resists that desire. Two names, two worlds, and two very different questions being asked. Understanding this divide is not about dismissing curiosity. It is about restoring scale and purpose to ancient voices. Each tradition spoke to its own fears, hopes, and struggles. When those voices are blended carelessly, the past becomes quieter, not clearer. This separation is the foundation for everything that follows, because only by keeping worlds distinct can real comparison begin without distortion or loss. Clarity begins with separation. The Watchers do not appear suddenly as cosmic intruders or mysterious visitors from nowhere. Their oldest form is grounded in a specific moment in Jewish history, shaped by real pressures and real fears. The earliest and most detailed source for the Watchers is a collection of writings known today as First Enoch, especially the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers. These texts were written during the Second Temple era, roughly between the 3rd century before Christ and the early 2nd century before Christ, long before later legends and modern theories reshaped the story. First, Enoch was not part of the Hebrew Bible, but it was widely read and respected among certain Jewish communities. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, confirming that these ideas circulated centuries before Christianity. The Book of the Watchers expands a brief and strange passage from Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God take human wives and produce offspring called the Nephilim. Genesis gives no explanation. Enoch fills the silence with detail, structure, and judgment. In this earliest form, the Watchers are angels assigned to observe humanity. Their role is not leadership or instruction, it is supervision. They are meant to watch, not interfere. The text names them, counts them, and places them within a heavenly order. They descend to earth, not as conquerors, but as guardians who fail. Their crime is not curiosity alone, it is desire. They take human wives, swear oaths together, and bind themselves to a choice they know violates divine order. The Book of the Watchers emphasizes consequences more than spectacle. The union between Watchers and humans produces giants who consume resources, spread violence, and destabilize the world. This chaos is not random. It is presented as the direct result of crossing a boundary meant to protect creation. The giants are not heroes or gods. They are symptoms. Their existence explains why the earth becomes filled with bloodshed and why divine intervention becomes necessary. Equally important is what the Watchers teach. The text lists specific forms of knowledge they reveal, including weapon making, astrology, sorcery, cosmetics, and divination. These are not neutral skills in this worldview. They accelerate human corruption and imbalance. The message is clear. Knowledge without restraint leads to destruction. This is not a story about progress. It is a warning about timing, authority, and limits. Judgment arrives swiftly in the narrative. God commands loyal angels to bind the Watchers and imprison them beneath the earth until a final reckoning. Their children are destroyed. The flood becomes a reset, not a mythic accident. In this earliest form, the Watcher's story is tightly focused. It explains evil without blaming God. It preserves divine justice. It frames history as moral cause and effect. Nothing in this early tradition suggests extraterrestrials, ancient astronauts, or forgotten gods. The Watchers are angels in rebellion, written for an audience struggling to understand suffering under empire. Their story belongs to theology, not technology. When later generations reinterpret them, they are not uncovering something hidden. They are moving far away from where the Watchers began. The word Watchers sounds mysterious to modern ears, but in its ancient setting, it was practical and precise. In the original languages behind the texts, the term does not describe aliens, rulers, or hidden gods. It describes a function. In the book of Daniel, written during the Second Temple period in the 2nd century before Christ, the word translated as watcher comes from an Aramaic root meaning one who is awake, alert, or vigilant. The watcher is defined by what it does, not by where it comes from or how powerful it is. In Daniel chapter 4, the watcher appears in a vision given to the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. A holy watcher descends from heaven and announces judgment. The figure is not acting independently. It speaks with authority that clearly comes from God. The watcher does not debate, teach, or rebel. It observes, announces, and carries out a decree. This is important because it shows that the term watcher already had a specific role before the Book of Enoch ever expanded the idea. A watcher is an enforcer of divine order, not a free agent. The Book of Enoch builds on this meaning, rather than inventing a new one. In Enoch, the watchers are still observers. They are still meant to be awake to human behavior. The tragedy of the story is that they abandon this role. They stop watching and start participating. The name becomes ironic. Those meant to remain alert and restrained fall asleep to their duty. The text uses the term deliberately to highlight failure, not mystery. Language matters here because later interpretations ignore how ancient readers understood these words. The Hebrew and Aramaic roots emphasize vigilance and oversight. There is no hint of spacecraft, advanced science, or foreign planets. The Watchers are part of a heavenly bureaucracy, similar to messengers, scribes, or guards. They exist within a moral chain of command. This fits the broader worldview of Second Temple Judaism. Heaven is organized. Angels have names, ranks, and assignments. Some deliver messages, some carry out punishment. Some stand in God's presence. The Watchers belong to this system. When they fall, they are punished precisely because they violated their role. The narrative only works if they were never meant to rule or teach humanity in the first place. Later translations into Greek and other languages preserved the basic meaning, even if the tone shifted. The Greek term used in some versions still emphasizes alertness and supervision. Over time, readers unfamiliar with the cultural background began to treat Watcher as a title instead of a job description. Once that shift happened, speculation rushed in to fill the gap. Understanding what Watchers actually means pulls the story back into focus. These beings are not ancient astronauts remembered poorly. They are not foreign gods misunderstood by later religions. They are moral symbols within a Jewish framework that explains why boundaries exist and why crossing them brings consequences. The name Watcher does not point outward to the stars. It points inward to responsibility, restraint, and failure. When the word is understood in its original sense, much of the modern confusion simply dissolves. The descent to Earth is the turning point of the Watchers' tradition and the moment where supervision becomes rebellion. In the Book of the Watchers, these beings are sent to observe humanity, not to rule it or reshape it. They are stationed above, aware, restrained, and accountable. Their descent is not portrayed as a heroic mission or a gift to humans. It is a deliberate choice to cross a boundary that was never theirs to cross. According to 1st Enoch, a group of Watchers descends to the earth during the days before the flood. The text emphasizes intention. They see human women, desire them, and discuss the risk of punishment. This is not ignorance. It is awareness followed by agreement. They bind themselves with an oath, choosing shared guilt over obedience. The descent is therefore moral, not spatial. The problem is not coming down. The problem is choosing to stay. Once the line is crossed, the consequences unfold quickly in the text. The Watchers take wives and begin to teach humans knowledge that was not meant for them. This includes tools for war, methods of enchantment, and signs for reading the heavens. The narrative stresses imbalance. Humans gain power without wisdom, and violence spreads. The earth is described as crying out under the weight of bloodshed and disorder. The descent also reframes the flood itself. In earlier biblical tradition, the flood appears sudden and brief. Enoch turns it into a response. The Watcher's descent explains why judgment is necessary. It is not humanity alone that fails. Heaven has failed as well. The boundary between realms collapses and creation destabilizes. The flood becomes an act of containment, not revenge. What matters most is that this descent is not framed as progress. It is not enlightenment. It is transgression. The Watchers are not praised for helping humanity. They are condemned for accelerating its destruction. Their story warns that even divine beings are bound by limits. Authority does not erase responsibility. Power does not justify intrusion. Later readers often miss this emphasis and imagine the descent as a gift of civilization. That idea does not come from Enoch. In the oldest form of the text, descent marks the moment everything begins to go wrong. It is the first crack in cosmic order. Everything that follows flows from that single choice. When the Watchers descend, they do not arrive as gods of another culture. They arrive as failures within their own system. Their story is inward-facing, meant to explain moral collapse, not cultural borrowing. Understanding the descent in this way keeps the narrative anchored where it belongs, inside Jewish thought and its struggle with justice and responsibility. This context matters because removing it turns a moral warning into a mystery hunt. The ancient writers were not hiding technology. They were explaining consequences. The descent to Earth is not a memory of visitors. It is a lesson about boundaries and the cost of crossing them. This meaning has endured for centuries in its setting. The Watcher's story does not stop with descent. It moves immediately into explanation. Why was the world described as violent and corrupt before the flood? Why did creation seem broken beyond repair? The Book of the Watchers answers by focusing on the offspring of this forbidden union and the chain reaction they unleash. Giants are not side characters in the story. They are the engine of chaos. According to 1st Enoch, the children born from Watchers and human women grow unnaturally large and powerful. Their size is symbolic as much as physical. They consume more than the earth can provide. When food runs out, they turn on humanity. Violence escalates. Warfare spreads. Blood fills the land. The text emphasizes imbalance. These beings take without restraint and give nothing back. The natural order cannot sustain them. The giants also represent unchecked power. They are stronger than humans and unaccountable to divine law. In the worldview of Second Temple Judaism, this is a recipe for collapse. Power without limits leads to oppression. The giants are not celebrated heroes or builders of civilization. They are predators. Their existence explains why the earth becomes filled with cries of suffering. As the violence spreads, corruption deepens. The Watchers' teachings compound the damage. Humans learn weapon making and use it for domination. They learn enchantments and use them to manipulate. They learn signs of the heavens and turn them into tools of control rather than wisdom. Knowledge accelerates chaos instead of healing it. The narrative draws a straight line from forbidden teaching to social breakdown. This context gives the flood its logic. The flood is not random destruction, it is containment. The earth itself is described as crying out, appealing for relief. God responds by eliminating the source of corruption. The giants are destroyed. Their spirits become restless forces associated with later ideas of evil spirits, according to some traditions. The Watchers are bound and removed from influence. Humanity is reset. What matters here is how tightly the story fits together. The Watchers descend, boundaries are crossed, giants are born, violence spreads, judgment follows. This sequence is moral, not mythical chaos. It explains suffering while preserving divine justice. God does not create evil. Evil emerges from rebellion and misuse of power. Later interpretations often strip the giants of this function and turn them into proof of lost civilizations or ancient visitors. That misses the point entirely. The giants exist to explain why restraint matters. They are cautionary figures, not memories of real rulers. Their exaggerated form highlights excess and imbalance. The flood logic also pushes back against ideas of progress through domination. Bigger is not better in this worldview. Stronger is not wiser. The destruction of the giants is presented as necessary for life to continue. Without limits, even creation itself becomes unsustainable. Understanding this framework helps clarify why the Watcher's story was compelling to ancient readers. It addressed real fears of violence, empire, and injustice. It offered a reason for suffering and a promise that chaos would not last forever. Giants and violence are not random fantasy elements. They are tools for moral explanation. When this structure is ignored, the story becomes distorted. Giants turn into mysteries. The flood becomes a cover-up. The original message disappears. The Watcher's tradition survives because it made sense of a broken world. That purpose is lost when the story is pulled out of its historical and moral frame. In the Watcher's tradition, the most serious offense is not size, strength, or even rebellion alone. It is teaching what should not be taught. The Book of the Watchers makes this clear by listing knowledge as the central crime that turns imbalance into disaster. The Watchers are punished not simply for desire, but for passing on skills and practices that humanity was not prepared to handle responsibly. the text names specific forms of forbidden knowledge. Metalworking becomes weapon making. The forging of swords, knives, and armor transforms human conflict into organized violence. What could be a neutral craft becomes a tool for domination. The writers of Enoch were living under empires armed with advanced weapons, so this warning would have felt immediate and real. Technology, without moral restraint, meant suffering. Other teachings target the unseen. Enchantments, sorcery, and spells are introduced as ways to manipulate reality and people. These practices are portrayed as shortcuts to power, bypassing wisdom, patience, and ethical limits. In the worldview of the text, this knowledge corrupts trust and social order. It replaces accountability with control. Astrology and signs of the heavens are also included. This is not astronomy as observation, but divination as prediction and control. Reading the stars becomes a way to claim authority over fate. The text warns that when humans believe they can master destiny, humility disappears. The result is arrogance and fear, not understanding. Even cosmetics appear in the list. This surprises modern readers, but the concern is deception. Altering appearance is framed as hiding truth and fueling desire. The Watcher's teachings distort relationships by shifting focus from character to surface. This reinforces the theme that corruption spreads not only through violence, but through subtle reshaping of values. The key point is that knowledge itself is not evil in this tradition. Timing and authority matter. In Jewish thought, wisdom belongs to God and is given according to purpose. When the Watchers teach without permission, they disrupt that order. Knowledge arrives without guidance. Power arrives without responsibility. The result is collapse. This theme runs through Second Temple literature beyond Enoch. Wisdom is praised when it leads to justice and restraint. Knowledge is condemned when it feeds pride and harm. The Watcher's story uses exaggerated examples to make the danger unmistakable. These beings introduce shortcuts to power, and the world breaks under the weight. Later interpretations often flip this message. The Watchers are recast as benefactors who uplift humanity. That reading comes from modern values, not ancient ones. For the original writers, rapid advancement without moral grounding was terrifying. It mirrored their experience under vast empires where power flowed downward without mercy. The punishment of the Watchers reflects this concern. They are bound not only for disobedience, but to prevent further teaching. The threat is not their presence alone, but their influence. Removing them restores balance by slowing the spread of destructive knowledge. Seen this way, the Watcher's story is less about ancient secrets and more about limits. It warns that some knowledge, when delivered without wisdom, can destroy the very people it claims to help. This message resonated in the ancient world and still echoes today. The Watcher's story ends not with mystery, but with containment. In the Book of the Watchers, judgment is deliberate, organized, and final. Once the scale of corruption becomes clear, divine response follows a clear sequence. Loyal angels are sent to confront the rebels. The authority comes from God, not from cosmic conflict or rival powers. This matters because it reinforces the moral framework of the text. Order is restored through justice, not force alone. The Watchers are addressed directly and condemned for their actions. They are reminded of their original place and purpose. Their punishment fits their crime. They crossed boundaries, so they are restrained. They taught forbidden knowledge, so they are silenced. The text describes them being bound and imprisoned beneath the earth, in dark places reserved for holding, not annihilation. This is not destruction. It is suspension. This imprisonment serves two purposes. First, it stops further damage. The Watchers can no longer influence humanity or teach corrupting practices. Second, it preserves accountability. The Watchers are not erased from existence. They are held until a final judgment. This reflects a broader belief in delayed justice, common in Second Temple thought. Wrongdoing does not always meet immediate resolution, but it will be addressed fully in time. The imagery of binding is symbolic as well as literal within the narrative. Binding represents the restoration of limits. These beings once moved freely between realms. Now they are confined. The message is clear. Freedom without obedience leads to loss of freedom altogether. Power misused results in power removed. The fate of the giants connects to this judgment. Their physical forms are destroyed, but later traditions suggest their spirits linger as restless forces. This idea appears in later Jewish and early Christian writings and helps explain beliefs about evil spirits without attributing them to divine creation. Again, the framework protects God from blame. Corruption originates from rebellion, not from design. Importantly, this ending leaves no room for secret survival or hidden rule. The Watchers do not retreat to the shadows to guide humanity quietly. They are cut off. Their story is finished within the ancient worldview. Any later claims of continued interaction come from outside the original tradition. The final judgment theme also ties the Watcher's story to later apocalyptic expectations. Justice may be delayed, but it is never cancelled. This gave hope to communities living under oppression. Empires rise and fall. Violence spreads, but moral order remains intact beyond human history. Modern interpretations often turn this imprisonment into evidence of hidden bases or underground civilizations. That reading ignores the symbolic language of the text. Darkness represents removal from influence. Depth represents separation from the living world. These are theological ideas, not geographic hints. When the Watchers are bound, the story closes its moral loop. Boundaries are restored, knowledge is restrained, creation is given space to heal. The flood cleanses the surface. Imprisonment secures the source. Together, they explain how order returns. Understanding this ending is essential because it shows the intent of the tradition. The Watcher's story is not open-ended. It is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is a warning that reaches its conclusion. Rebellion meets judgment. Corruption meets restraint. And the world moves forward without them. Before the internet and before modern speculation, the Anunnaki existed only in clay, ritual, and language. They were not hidden visitors or fallen angels. They were gods within the religious world of Mesopotamia. Their name appears in some of the earliest written records humanity produced, carved into tablets by Sumerian scribes in the 3rd millennium before Christ. These texts were not secret histories. They were public religion tied to temples, kings, and daily life. The Anunnaki belonged to a pantheon that assumed many gods, each with defined roles. At the top stood An or Anu, the sky god associated with authority and legitimacy. The Anunnaki are described as his offspring or as gods connected to his sphere of power. This does not mean biological children in a modern sense. It means belonging to a divine category. They function as a collective, often appearing in groups rather than as individual characters with personal stories. Across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian sources, the Anunnaki are involved in decisions that shape the world. They decree fate, they confirm kingship, they uphold cosmic order. In some texts, they are associated with the underworld, acting as judges of the dead. In others, they appear in assemblies where the gods debate and resolve crises. There is no rebellion narrative attached to the Anunnaki. They do not fall from heaven. They do not corrupt humanity through forbidden teaching. Humans in Mesopotamian religion are created to serve the gods, to maintain temples, and to offer sacrifices. Knowledge flows downward by design. If humans suffer, it is often because the gods are displeased, not because divine beings broke rules. This difference is crucial. Mesopotamian religion does not wrestle with the problem of evil the way Jewish apocalyptic thought does. There is no single moral lawgiver whose justice must be defended. The gods are powerful, sometimes unpredictable, and tied to natural forces. Flood stories exist, but they serve different purposes. The Anunnaki also lack the teaching lists that define the Watchers. They are not remembered for introducing weapons, magic, or astrology illegally. These arts already exist within Mesopotamian culture and are often gifts from the gods. The boundary violations that drive the Watcher's story are absent here. Understanding the Anunnaki in their original context strips away much of the modern mystery. They are not shadows of another tradition. They are fully formed within their system. Their names, functions, and authority are embedded in ritual life and royal ideology. When later writers claim the Anunnaki were fallen angels, they are importing ideas that did not exist in Mesopotamia. This is not reinterpretation, it is replacement. The ancient texts do not hint at secret origins or hidden agendas. They present gods doing what gods were expected to do. Before the internet connected distant myths into a single storyline, the Anunnaki stood firmly in their world. They were part of a religion that explained power, order, and survival. To understand them, they must be read in the clay tablets and temples of Mesopotamia. The Anunnaki are defined less by dramatic stories and more by steady function. Across Mesopotamian myth, they are not wandering figures or rule breakers, they are administrators of the universe. Their role is to maintain order between gods, humans, and the forces of nature. This role appears consistently from early Sumerian texts through Akkadian and Babylonian sources, even as names and emphasis shift over time. In many myths, the Anunnaki appear as an assembly. They gather to deliberate and to decide outcomes that affect the world. These decisions include the confirmation of kings, the assignment of divine authority, and the enforcement of cosmic laws. Kingship in Mesopotamia is never just political. It is sacred. When a king rules, it is because the gods approve. The Anunnaki serve as witnesses and guarantors of that approval. They also appear in myths dealing with creation and labor. In some traditions, lower gods complain about the burden of maintaining the world. Humans are then created to take on that labor, farming, building temples, and offering sacrifices. The Anunnaki oversee this arrangement. Humans are not students or partners, they are workers. This explains why teaching humanity secret knowledge is not a crime in Mesopotamian thought. Knowledge exists to serve the gods. In underworld texts, the Anunnaki take on another role. They act as judges of the dead. When a person dies, they enter a shadowy realm ruled by deities associated with death and decay. The Anunnaki preside over this realm, not to reward or punish morally, but to assign a place within the afterlife order. There is no final judgment like later apocalyptic traditions. Death is not a moral reckoning, it is a continuation of hierarchy. Flood myths further illustrate their function. In the Epic of Gilgamesh and related texts, the gods decide to send a flood for reasons tied to noise, disruption, or divine irritation. One god may warn a human, but the Anunnaki as a group enforce the decision. There is regret afterward, but not moral guilt. The gods act, the world changes, and life continues. What stands out across these sources is stability. The Anunnaki do not rebel. They do not fall. They do not cross forbidden boundaries with humans. They are powerful, but they operate within their system. Conflict among gods exists, but it is political, not moral in the later sense. This makes direct comparison with the Watchers difficult. The Watchers' story is driven by failure and punishment. The Anunnaki story is driven by authority and maintenance. One explains why the world went wrong. The other explains why the world works as it does. Modern retellings often assign the Anunnaki roles they never held: teachers of forbidden knowledge, genetic engineers, or fallen rulers. These ideas come from outside the ancient texts. In the original myths, the Anunnaki do not need to hide. They are openly worshipped, named, and invoked. Understanding what the Anunnaki do requires reading them where they belong: in temples, in royal inscriptions, and in myths meant to reinforce social order. They are not mysterious intruders. They are pillars of a world view where gods rule and humans serve. The name Anunnaki sounds exotic today, but in the ancient texts it is rooted in simple linguistic structure. The term is closely tied to An or Anu, the Mesopotamian sky god whose name represented authority, heaven, and legitimacy. Anunnaki does not mean those who came from the stars or those who descended from the sky in a technological sense. It means the gods associated with Anu or those of Anu. The phrase marks status, not origin story. In Sumerian and Akkadian languages, divine names often function as categories rather than personal labels. When a text speaks of the Anunnaki, it is referring to a group of gods connected to Anu's authority. This connection is symbolic and political within the divine world. Anu sits at the top of the pantheon, even when he is not active in a story. The Anunnaki derive their importance from that association. They are not described as his literal children walking the earth. They are members of a ruling class. Translation is where problems begin. Ancient languages compress meaning into short phrases that do not map cleanly onto modern expectations. When Anunnaki is translated loosely as offspring of Anu, readers often imagine physical descent or family drama. That is not how ancient Mesopotamians thought about their gods. Divine lineage expressed rank and function, not biology. The gods were eternal. They did not reproduce in human ways. Modern interpretations often pull the name apart and rebuild it with modern assumptions. Sky, God, becomes space. Heaven becomes orbit. Offspring becomes engineered beings. None of these steps are supported by the texts themselves. They are interpretive leaps layered onto the word long after its meaning was established. Cuneiform tablets that mention the Anunnaki do not pause to explain who they are because the audience already knew. These texts were written for insiders, for priests, scribes, and kings. The Anunnaki are invoked in rituals, legal oaths, and royal inscriptions. Their authority is assumed. There is no mystery attached to their identity in their own time. This is why claims that the Anunnaki were misunderstood, Watchers, or fallen angels run into trouble. The Watchers are defined by rebellion and punishment. The Anunnaki are defined by legitimacy and continuity. Even when they appear in underworld settings, they remain judges, not prisoners. Their power is not stripped away, it is exercised. The problem of translation becomes worse when ancient words are filtered through modern agendas. In the 20th century, popular writers began reading cuneiform through science fiction lenses. Words like heaven and sky were treated as literal locations rather than symbolic realms. Titles were treated as personal names. Metaphor was flattened into mechanics. Serious scholars do not read the texts this way. They compare tablets across centuries, track how words are used in different contexts, and resist single definitions that ignore nuance. Within that careful work, Anunnaki remains a collective term for gods of high status connected to Anu's authority. Understanding this helps separate ancient belief from modern imagination. The Anunnaki were never hidden. They were never secret teachers or fallen rulers. Their name does not conceal advanced technology or lost history. It reflects how ancient Mesopotamians organized their divine world. When translation respects context, the mystery dissolves. What remains is not less interesting, but clearer. The Anunnaki are exactly what the texts present them to be. Powerful gods within a polytheistic system, defined by role and rank, not by rebellion or disguise. The Watchers and the Anunnaki belong to different genres, and genre shapes meaning more than names ever could. Mesopotamian texts that describe the Anunnaki are mythic theology. They explain how the world is structured, why kings rule, and how humans fit into a universe governed by many gods. Jewish texts that describe the Watchers are apocalyptic moral narratives. They explain why the world is broken, who is responsible, and what judgment awaits. When these genres are mixed, confusion follows. Mythic theology is concerned with stability. Mesopotamian myths assume the world is fundamentally ordered, even if that order can be harsh. The gods argue, negotiate, and sometimes act impulsively, but the system itself endures. Floods happen, cities fall, kings rise and die, yet the cosmic structure remains intact. The Anunnaki operate inside this framework. Their actions reinforce hierarchy and continuity. Apocalyptic literature does the opposite. It assumes the present world is wrong. Something has gone off course. Evil is not just a fact of life, but a violation that demands correction. Jewish apocalyptic writers lived under foreign empires and constant threat. They needed explanations that preserved God's justice despite visible injustice. The Watcher's story serves that need. It explains how corruption entered the world without blaming God. Because of this difference, similar imagery functions differently. Descent from heaven in Mesopotamian myth can signal authority or presence. Descent in apocalyptic literature signals transgression. Teaching humans skills in Mesopotamia reinforces divine dominance. Teaching humans forbidden knowledge in Enoch accelerates collapse. The same surface action carries opposite meaning because the goals of the texts are different. Mythic theology looks backward and outward. It explains origins and maintains tradition. Apocalyptic narrative looks forward and upward. It anticipates judgment and restoration. The Anunnaki belong to stories meant to be repeated in ritual. The Watchers belong to stories meant to warn and provoke change. This is why attempts to merge the two flatten both traditions. When the Anunnaki are recast as fallen Watchers, their role as stabilizing authorities disappears. When the Watchers are recast as misunderstood gods, their moral warning vanishes. What remains is a simplified hybrid that satisfies curiosity but ignores purpose. Ancient audiences understood genre instinctively. A priest reading a temple hymn did not expect a moral apocalypse. A Jewish reader studying Enoch did not expect a neutral explanation of cosmic bureaucracy. Each text answered different questions. Who rules the world? Why is the world unjust? How should humans respond? Modern readers often approach ancient texts with a single expectation. They search for hidden facts rather than expressed meaning. In doing so, they treat all ancient writing as if it were the same kind of record. This erases the difference between theology and warning, between myth and critique. Understanding genre restores clarity. The Watcher's story belongs to a tradition wrestling with evil and responsibility. The Anunnaki belong to a tradition organizing power and ritual. They are not pieces of a shared puzzle, they are answers to different problems. When genre is respected, comparison becomes careful instead of careless. Similar themes can be noted without forcing identity. Influence can be discussed without collapsing distinction. The result is not a single secret history, but a richer understanding of how ancient cultures used stories to make sense of their world. Most claims that the Watchers and the Anunnaki are the same begin with a short list of similarities repeated across websites and videos. These points sound convincing at first because they focus on surface features rather than structure. Both groups are described as coming from heaven. Both are powerful. Both are connected to early human history. Both appear before great floods. When placed side by side, the overlap feels obvious. But similarity in language does not equal identity in meaning. The first claim centers on descent from the sky. The Watchers descend from heaven. The Anunnaki are associated with the sky god Anu. Online arguments often stop here, but ancient cultures used sky language constantly. The sky represented authority, not location. Kings ruled by heaven's mandate. Storms came from heaven. Law descended from heaven. This imagery does not imply shared beings. It reflects shared symbolism. Another common point is knowledge. Watchers teach humans. Anunnaki are gods associated with civilization. This collapses two very different ideas. In Enoch, teaching is a crime that leads to destruction. In Mesopotamia, knowledge is a gift that sustains order. Writing, agriculture, and law are celebrated as divine blessings. The direction and outcome of knowledge in each tradition move opposite ways. Giants are also used as a bridge. The Watchers produce giants. Mesopotamian texts mention powerful heroes and kings of great stature. These are not the same concept. The giants in Enoch are symbols of imbalance and excess. Mesopotamian heroes represent divine favor and legitimacy. Size alone is not a shared identity marker. Flood stories are another favorite connection. Both traditions include floods, but floods appear across many cultures because rivers flood and disasters happen. In Enoch, the flood is moral judgment. In Mesopotamian myth, it is a divine decision driven by noise or disruption. The reasons matter more than the event. Some arguments focus on rulership. The Anunnaki help decide kingship. The Watchers influence humanity. But influence in one case is authorized and structured. In the other, it is forbidden and punished. The texts do not describe the same kind of authority. Language confusion fuels many of these claims. Translations vary. Words like heaven, God, angel, and spirit shift across cultures. When these words are treated as interchangeable, distinct traditions blur. Ancient readers would not have done this. They knew which stories belonged where. Modern culture also rewards synthesis. A single hidden truth is more exciting than parallel explanations. Algorithms amplify bold claims, not careful distinctions. Over time, repetition creates the illusion of evidence. Testing these similarities requires slowing down. When each claim is examined within its original context, the match weakens. Shared imagery reflects shared human experience, not shared beings. The Watchers and the Anunnaki do not align when roles, goals, and consequences are compared. The overlap exists only at the surface. Beneath that, the stories move in different directions. Understanding where people think they match helps explain why the idea persists. It also shows why historical comparison must go deeper than appearance. Without that depth, similarity becomes illusion. Ancient cultures across the world placed power in the sky, but that does not mean they were describing the same beings. Sky origin is one of the most common symbols in human history. The sky is distant, unreachable, and uncontrollable. Storms come from above. Light comes from above. Authority feels like it comes from above. When ancient texts speak of beings from heaven, they are speaking a shared symbolic language, not identifying shared characters. In Mesopotamia, heaven is the realm of gods because gods rule. Anu is a sky god because the sky represents ultimate authority. The Anunnaki are associated with that authority. They do not arrive from heaven as strangers. They belong there by definition. Their connection to the sky establishes rank, not movement. In Jewish apocalyptic literature, heaven functions differently. Heaven is not simply where God lives, it is the seat of moral order. Beings who come from heaven carry responsibility. When they descend, the act is charged with ethical meaning. A descent can signal obedience, like a messenger delivering judgment, or rebellion, like the watchers crossing a forbidden line. The sky is not a neutral backdrop, it is a moral boundary. This difference is critical. When modern readers see two groups linked to the sky, they often assume shared origin. Ancient readers did not think this way. Sky language was a category, not a fingerprint. Many beings could belong to heaven without being the same kind of being. Angels, gods, messengers, spirits, stars, and even kings could be described using sky imagery. This did not confuse ancient audiences because context clarified role. A being's function mattered more than its location. What does it do? Who does it serve? What happens when it acts? The Watchers fail because they abandon their role. Their heavenly origin makes their rebellion worse, not more impressive. The Anunnaki do not fail because they never leave their role. Their heavenly association confirms stability, not disruption. Modern comparison often strips away this functional thinking. It treats heaven like a physical place similar to outer space. From that view, any being from the sky becomes a candidate for the same identity. This approach belongs to science fiction, not ancient religion. Ancient writers were not trying to map the universe. They were explaining order and disorder. Heaven and earth were relational spaces, not coordinates. Movement between them signaled obedience or violation, not travel. This is why claims that Watchers and Anunnaki must be the same because both come from heaven collapse under scrutiny. Heaven is not specific enough to define identity. It is a shared symbol used differently by different cultures. Understanding this helps prevent false mergers. It allows comparison without confusion. Two traditions can use the same image while telling different stories. The sky can host many kinds of beings without collapsing them into one. Heavenly origin is the starting point of interpretation, not the conclusion. Identity emerges from role, purpose, and consequence. When those elements are examined, the Watchers and the Anunnaki stand apart. Respecting that difference does not weaken ancient stories. It strengthens them by letting each speak clearly. The sky was big enough for many meanings. Treating it as a single address flattens the past instead of revealing it. Across cultures and centuries, stories about beings who bring knowledge appear again and again. This repetition often leads to the assumption that all knowledge bringers are versions of the same figures. But when these stories are examined closely, the meaning of knowledge changes dramatically depending on the culture telling it. The motif is universal, but the message is not. In Mesopotamian tradition, knowledge is largely a gift. Writing, agriculture, law, and city building are presented as divine tools meant to stabilize society. Gods teach humans so that humans can serve the gods better. Knowledge strengthens order. It supports kingship, ritual, and survival in a harsh environment. There is little anxiety about humans knowing too much. The problem is humans failing to honor the gods properly. In contrast, Jewish apocalyptic literature treats knowledge with caution. Knowledge is powerful, but dangerous when misused or mistimed. In the Watchers tradition, the issue is not that humans learn new things, but how and from whom they learn them. Knowledge given outside divine permission leads to imbalance. The Watchers do not teach wisdom. They teach shortcuts to power. This difference is critical. The Book of the Watchers lists specific teachings to make this point clear. Weapon making turns conflict into mass violence. Enchantments manipulate rather than heal. Astrology becomes control over fate instead of wonder at creation. Even beauty practices are criticized because they distort relationships. Knowledge in this framework accelerates corruption instead of improving life. Other cultures reflect similar concerns in different ways. In Greek myth, Prometheus brings fire to humanity. Fire is a gift that enables progress, but it also brings punishment. Prometheus is chained. Humans gain power, but suffering follows. The story balances advancement with consequence. It does not present knowledge as free or harmless. These examples show that knowledge bringers are not a single category. They reflect cultural values. Some societies celebrate teaching as civilization itself. Others warn that knowledge must be governed by wisdom and restraint. Both approaches address real human experience. Power can build or destroy. Modern interpretations often ignore this nuance. When ancient beings who teach are grouped together, their cultural warnings disappear. The Watchers are reimagined as helpers. Mesopotamian gods are recast as secret manipulators. The original intent of the stories is lost. It is tempting to believe that all ancient cultures remembered the same teachers. That idea feels unifying, but it flattens diversity. Ancient peoples were not recording the same event. They were responding to different fears and needs. The Watcher's story speaks to communities worried about unchecked power and moral collapse. Mesopotamian myths speak to societies focused on survival, hierarchy, and divine favor. Knowledge functions differently in each because life demanded different lessons. Seeing knowledge bringers as a universal motif rather than a shared identity restores meaning. It allows each tradition to speak on its own terms. It also explains why the Watchers are punished while the Anunnaki are praised. The issue is not knowledge itself, it is the framework governing it. Understanding this distinction dissolves another layer of confusion. Similar stories do not require identical origins. They reveal how humans everywhere grapple with power, progress, and limits. Knowledge has always been double-edged. Ancient cultures knew this well. Their stories reflect caution as much as curiosity. When those stories are respected in context, the Watchers and the Anunnaki no longer blur together. They stand as different answers to the same human question. What happens when we learn too much, too fast, without wisdom? Giants and hybrids are where many ancient traditions collapse into one another in the modern imagination. When people hear of enormous beings or mixed origins, they instinctively connect stories that were never meant to meet. This is the conflation trap. It happens when surface traits replace structure and when difference is mistaken for distance rather than meaning. In the Watchers tradition, giants are a direct result of boundary violation. They are born from unions that were never permitted. Their size and strength are not blessings. They are signs of imbalance. The giants consume too much, destroy too much, and destabilize the world around them. Their existence explains why violence spreads beyond control before the flood. They are not rulers or builders. They are symptoms of disorder. In other ancient cultures, large or powerful figures serve different purposes. Mesopotamian kings are sometimes described with exaggerated stature to emphasize authority. Heroes in epics like Gilgamesh are larger than life to mark divine favor. These figures are not moral problems. They are ideals or warnings of a different kind. Size here represents legitimacy, not corruption. The problem begins when all large beings are labeled giants and treated as the same category. Once that happens, stories bleed together. The Nephilim from Jewish texts are merged with heroic kings from Mesopotamia. The moral warning embedded in one tradition is erased by the political symbolism of another. The result is a hybrid narrative that no ancient writer would recognize. Hybrids make this worse. The Watcher's offspring are hybrids in a specific sense. They are the result of forbidden mixing between divine and human realms. This mixing violates cosmic order. In contrast, many ancient myths include gods interacting with humans without moral panic. Those unions often produce heroes, founders, or kings. The difference lies in permission and purpose. Modern retellings often ignore this distinction. Any story involving divine-human mixing is treated as proof of ancient experimentation or shared memory. But ancient cultures did not share a single rulebook. What was forbidden in one worldview was normal in another. Without understanding that, hybrid stories lose their meaning. The conflation trap is reinforced by selective reading. Passages are pulled out of context and grouped by theme rather than function. Giants become evidence. Hybrids become clues. The original moral or social lesson disappears. Language also plays a role. Words like giant, hero, demigod, and offspring are treated as interchangeable. In ancient texts, they are not. Each carries assumptions about order, legitimacy, and consequence. This trap thrives in modern spaces because it simplifies complexity. A single ancient race feels more exciting than multiple traditions responding to different realities. But simplicity comes at a cost. It turns warnings into mysteries and lessons into puzzles. Understanding giants and hybrids requires discipline. The question is not who looks similar, but why a culture told the story it did. The Watcher's giants explain collapse. Mesopotamian heroes explain continuity. They do opposite work. When traditions are merged incorrectly, they stop teaching. The Watcher's story loses its warning about boundaries. Mesopotamian myth loses its explanation of authority. Both become distorted shadows of themselves. Avoiding the conflation trap restores clarity. It allows giants to mean excess where excess matters and greatness where greatness is intended. It keeps hybrids within their moral framework instead of turning them into evidence of a hidden past. Ancient stories survive because they spoke clearly to their own people. They only become confusing when we force them into a single modern narrative. As centuries passed, ancient stories did not remain frozen. They were copied, interpreted, debated, and expanded as new communities faced new questions. This process accelerated during late antiquity, roughly from the 3rd century after Christ to the 6th. Jewish, Christian, and later Islamic thinkers inherited older traditions and reshaped them to fit changing theological needs. The Watcher's story was no exception. By this time, the Book of Enoch was no longer central scripture for most Jewish communities, but its ideas had already spread. Early Christian writers were aware of the Watchers' tradition and debated its meaning. Some accepted it as a useful explanation for evil spirits and corruption. Others were uneasy with how much power it gave to rebellious angels. Over time, elements of the story were absorbed, while the text itself faded from common use. One major shift involved the identity of demons. In earlier Jewish thought, the spirits of the giants destroyed in the flood were sometimes blamed for ongoing evil. This helped explain why suffering continued even after divine judgment. Early Christian writers adopted and modified this idea. Demons became associated with fallen angels more broadly, not just the Watchers. The story expanded beyond its original frame. Another shift involved Satan. In the Hebrew Bible, Satan is an accuser, not a cosmic rebel. During late antiquity, influenced by apocalyptic thought and Persian ideas of cosmic dualism, Satan became a central enemy figure. The Watcher's story was sometimes folded into this growing narrative of a war in heaven. Distinct traditions began to overlap. At the same time, allegorical reading became popular. Writers interpreted ancient texts symbolically rather than literally. The descent of the Watchers could represent moral decline. Their imprisonment could symbolize spiritual restraint. These interpretations were not wrong within their own frameworks, but they moved the story further from its original historical setting. Language changes also played a role. As texts moved from Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek and Latin, nuances shifted. Words for angel, demon, and spirit blurred. Readers unfamiliar with earlier contexts filled gaps with assumptions shaped by their own theology. This remixing was not a conspiracy. It was how tradition worked. Communities preserved what spoke to them and reinterpreted what no longer fit. Over centuries, layers accumulated. The Watchers became less a specific group and more a symbol of rebellion in general. By the time medieval thinkers encountered fragments of Enochic ideas, they were already filtered through centuries of interpretation. The original moral warning was still present, but wrapped in new concerns about heresy, temptation, and cosmic warfare. This long process matters because modern theories often skip it. They jump from ancient texts straight to modern conclusions, ignoring the centuries in between. When Watchers are equated with Anunnaki, the role of late antiquity is erased. The remix is treated as original. Understanding this history restores perspective. Ideas change not because secrets are revealed, but because questions change. The Watcher's story survived because it was adaptable. It could explain evil, demons, and temptation across eras. But adaptation is not identity. Expansion is not evidence of shared origin. Late antiquity reshaped many traditions without merging them into one. Seeing how old stories were remixed over time helps explain modern confusion. It also shows that the past is not a single voice, but a long conversation. When that conversation is flattened, meaning is lost. The Anunnaki did not change in ancient texts, but they changed dramatically in modern imagination during the 20th century. This shift did not come from new archaeological discoveries. It came from new ways of reading old material through the lens of science fiction, space exploration, and distrust of traditional authority. As rockets left Earth and humans looked toward the stars, ancient gods were quietly reassigned new identities. The early 20th century saw major advances in the study of cuneiform. Scholars translated thousands of tablets from Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian sources. These translations were careful, technical, and often cautious. They presented the Anunnaki as gods within a polytheistic system, just as earlier generations of scholars had understood. Nothing about these academic findings suggested extraterrestrials. The shift began outside academia. Popular writers started asking different questions. What if gods were misunderstood visitors? What if heaven meant space? What if ancient myths were memories of advanced beings? These questions fit perfectly into a century shaped by science fiction novels, Cold War secrecy, and rapid technological change. By the middle of the 20th century, ancient astronaut theories gained an audience. These ideas argued that early humans could not have built monuments or developed knowledge without outside help. Gods became engineers. Temples became landing sites. Myth became misunderstood history. Within this framework, the Anunnaki were ideal candidates. Their ancient name, their association with heaven, and their authority over humanity were repackaged as evidence. Crucially, this reinterpretation did not follow the structure of the original myths. It ignored genre, context, and language. Gods, who ruled symbolically, were recast as physical beings. Divine authority became technological superiority. Metaphor was treated as description. This process accelerated with television, paperback books, and later the internet. Simplified claims spread faster than scholarly corrections. Once the Anunnaki were labelled aliens in popular culture, that idea took on a life of its own. Repetition replaced evidence. By the late 20th century, the Anunnaki were no longer Mesopotamian gods in the public imagination. They were space travelers, genetic engineers, and hidden rulers. Their original role as divine administrators was almost entirely forgotten outside academic circles. This shift matters because it sets the stage for later conflations. Once gods are redefined as aliens, it becomes easy to merge traditions. The Watchers, already misunderstood, are pulled into the same framework. Different stories are combined because they now share a modern category that never existed in antiquity. The science fiction lens also changes the emotional tone. Ancient myths that once explained order and meaning are turned into thrillers about deception and control. Suspicion replaces theology. Mystery replaces moral warning. It is important to note that this transformation says more about the modern world than the ancient one. The 20th century was marked by rapid change, fear of unseen power, and fascination with technology. Ancient stories were reshaped to reflect those anxieties. Understanding when the Anunnaki became science fiction helps separate ancient belief from modern projection. The Anunnaki of clay tablets are not the Anunnaki of popular media. One belongs to religion, the other belongs to modern myth-making. This distinction is essential because without it, every comparison that follows rests on a false foundation. The Anunnaki did not evolve into aliens in the ancient world. They were rewritten that way in the modern one. The idea of Nibiru shows how speculation can harden into mythology when repetition replaces verification. In ancient Mesopotamian texts, Nibiru is not a hidden planet roaming the solar system. It is a word used in several contexts, most often meaning crossing or point of transition. In some astronomical texts, it refers to a marker star or a position in the sky associated with the god Marduk. It is not described as a rogue world carrying beings to Earth. The pipeline begins when modern writers isolate the word Nibiru from its context. Instead of reading it alongside other celestial terms, they treat it as a proper name for a single object. From there, translation choices are stretched. Crossing becomes planet, marker becomes traveller, symbol becomes machinery. Each step moves further from the tablets and closer to speculation. During the late 20th century, this reinterpretation gained momentum through popular books that claimed ancient texts described a hidden planet with a long orbit. According to these claims, the Anunnaki lived on this planet and visited Earth during close passes. These ideas were presented with confidence, footnotes, and selective quotations. For many readers, the appearance of scholarship was enough. What was missing was consensus. Professional Assyriologists did not support these readings. The original texts do not describe Nibiru as a homeworld, nor do they connect it consistently to the Anunnaki. In different tablets, Nibiru can refer to different celestial phenomena. There is no single definition because the word was not meant to carry one. The internet transformed this speculation into viral mythology. Short explanations travelled faster than corrections. Diagrams replaced grammar. Claims were repeated until familiarity felt like proof. Nibiru became Planet X, then a destroyer, then a home of gods. Each version borrowed authority from the last. This pipeline thrives because it offers a complete story. It explains ancient gods, modern disasters, and future judgment in one package. It also frames scholars as gatekeepers hiding the truth, which makes correction look like resistance rather than evidence. Importantly, ancient Mesopotamians did not fear Nibiru. It was not an omen of doom. It was part of a system that tracked order in the heavens. The fear attached to it today reflects modern anxiety, not ancient belief. Once Nibiru is accepted as a planet, it becomes a bridge. The Anunnaki become travelers. Other traditions are pulled in. The Watchers are reinterpreted as the same beings under a different name. What began as a translation issue becomes a unified myth. This is how speculation becomes viral mythology. A word is removed from context. A theory is repeated. Doubt is dismissed as suppression. Over time, the original meaning is forgotten entirely. Understanding the Nibiru pipeline shows how modern myths are built, not through discovery, but through accumulation. Each retelling adds confidence while subtracting nuance. When the ancient texts are revisited carefully, the structure collapses. Nibiru returns to being a term, not a planet. The Anunnaki return to being gods, not astronauts. The Watchers remain angels in a moral narrative. This matters because once the pipeline is exposed, the larger mashups lose their foundation. Viral mythology feels ancient, but it is young. It tells us far more about modern fears and hopes than about the ancient world it claims to reveal. The modern synthesis that turns gods into aliens and then into Watchers follows a predictable chain of ideas. First, ancient gods are stripped of theology and treated as physical beings. Heaven becomes space. Divine authority becomes advanced technology. Once this shift is accepted, gods no longer belong to religion. They become visitors. This move happens quietly, often without readers realizing what has been removed. Next, ancient texts are reread with modern assumptions. Metaphor is treated as description. Symbol becomes machine. When a god descends, it is read as a landing. When knowledge is shared, it is read as engineering. This approach does not ask what ancient writers meant, it asks what modern readers want the text to say. Once gods are recast as aliens, a second rebranding begins. Aliens are no longer neutral explorers, they are hidden rulers. They manipulate genetics, guide civilizations, and control human destiny. Suspicion replaces worship. Ancient religion is reframed as ancient deception. At this stage, evidence matters less than coherence. The story only needs to feel complete. From here, the Watchers are pulled into the framework. They already come from heaven. They already teach humans. They already fall. The logic seems effortless. If the Anunnaki were aliens and the Watchers were fallen beings from heaven, then they must be the same entities remembered differently. This conclusion feels elegant because it reduces complexity into one origin. What disappears in this chain is context at every step. Gods lose theology. Angels lose moral function. Genre disappears. Myth and apocalypse collapse into a single category called ancient history. Once this happens, comparison becomes confirmation. Similarity becomes proof. Differences are dismissed as corruption or censorship. This logic chain did not exist in antiquity. No ancient writer moved from Anunnaki to aliens to watchers. Each step is modern, built on modern expectations about technology, secrecy, and power. The synthesis feels ancient because it uses ancient names, but its structure is new. The appeal of this synthesis is emotional as much as intellectual. It suggests humanity has been managed rather than guided. It offers villains instead of responsibility. It turns moral warnings into thrillers. In doing so, it replaces difficult questions about human choices with external control. Understanding this rebranding chain does not require rejecting curiosity. It requires recognizing when explanation turns into invention. Gods became aliens because modern culture prefers technology to theology. Aliens became watchers because familiar names carry authority. The result is a loop that feeds itself. Breaking the loop means reversing the steps. Watchers return to angels in a moral narrative. Anunnaki return to gods in a mythic system. Aliens return to science fiction. When each belongs where it started, the synthesis loses its grip. What remains is not a single hidden truth, but multiple traditions speaking clearly again. The modern synthesis fades when history is allowed to speak without being recast. It survives only in confusion, not in careful reading or historical method. Clarity ends the spell. Accuracy matters. Context always wins. In the end here, when claims about watchers and Anunnaki are tested, everything comes back to the primary sources. Clay tablets, scroll fragments, and carefully preserved texts are where evidence begins and ends. These sources are not vague. They speak clearly when read in their original languages and historical settings. What they say is often less dramatic than modern theories, but far more consistent. In Jewish sources, like 1st Enoch, Daniel, and related Second Temple writings, the Watchers are described as angels within a moral framework. They are sent to observe. They disobey. They teach forbidden knowledge. They produce destruction. They are judged and imprisoned. This sequence appears repeatedly with variation in detail, but not in purpose. The Watchers are never described as creators of humanity, rulers of the earth, or beings from another world. Their role is limited, and their fate is sealed. The text does not leave room for survival, return, or hidden influence. The Mesopotamian sources tell a different story. Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian tablets describe the Anunnaki as gods connected to authority, fate, and order. They appear in hymns, legal formulas, and myths tied to temples and kings. They do not rebel, they do not fall, they do not teach secretly. Humans are created to serve the gods openly. The Anunnaki function as part of a system meant to endure, not as a problem meant to be solved. When modern claims say the Anunnaki created humans through genetic manipulation, the tablets do not support it. When claims say the Watchers were ancient astronauts, the texts do not suggest it. These ideas appear only after translation choices are stretched and context is removed. Primary sources do not hint at spaceships, advanced machinery, or hidden planets. The strongest evidence against the merger comes from what is missing. There is no ancient text that links the Watchers and the Anunnaki by name, role, or origin. There is no shared narrative where one becomes the other. The silence matters. Ancient writers were not shy about borrowing ideas. When they adopted foreign gods or stories, they said so. Here, they did not. Scholars across disciplines agree on this point. Assyriologists, biblical scholars, and historians approach these texts independently and arrive at the same conclusion. Similar imagery exists. Shared human concerns exist. Identity does not. Where modern theories see concealment, historians see difference. Primary sources also show intention. The Watcher's story exists to defend divine justice. The Anunnaki stories exist to support divine authority. These goals do not align. They answer different questions. They emerge from different pressures. Returning to the texts strips away speculation. It replaces viral certainty with grounded clarity. What remains is not a single secret history, but multiple traditions speaking honestly from their own worlds. Claims fade when evidence speaks. The Watchers remain angels in a warning story. The Anunnaki remain gods in a mythic system. Primary sources do not blur them. They separate them. When evidence is respected, the question changes. It is no longer were they the same. It becomes why modern readers want them to be. Even when evidence is clear, the mashup between Watchers and Anunnaki continues to spread. This persistence is not driven by ancient texts, but by modern psychology and culture. The idea survives because it satisfies emotional needs that careful history does not always meet. Understanding why it persists explains more about the present than the past. One major driver is the desire for a single hidden truth. Modern life is complex and fragmented. A theory that unifies myths, religions, and history into one secret storyline feels comforting. It replaces uncertainty with order. Instead of many cultures asking different questions, there is one answer behind everything. That simplicity is appealing, even when it is inaccurate. Distrust of authority also plays a role. In the 20th and 21st centuries, governments, corporations, and institutions have repeatedly failed public trust. This creates fertile ground for alternative explanations. When scholars say there is no connection, that denial itself becomes suspicious. The mashup thrives by framing experts as gatekeepers, hiding knowledge, rather than interpreters preserving context. There is also a psychological pull toward externalizing responsibility. The Watcher's story originally warned about misuse of power and moral failure. Modern retellings turn that inward lesson outward. If ancient beings manipulated humanity, then human violence, inequality, and destruction feel less like our fault. Blame shifts upward and outward. That shift is emotionally easier than confronting human agency. Media amplification intensifies this effect. Algorithms reward content that surprises, unsettles, or confirms existing beliefs. Careful explanations move slowly. Bold claims move fast. Over time, repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity feels like truth. The mashup becomes common knowledge even without evidence. Another factor is narrative satisfaction. The merged story has villains, secrets, and cosmic drama. It feels like a thriller. Ancient texts were not written to entertain in this way. They were written to warn, explain, or reinforce social order. Modern audiences often prefer mystery over moral reflection. Identity also matters. For some, believing in hidden ancient rulers provides a sense of insight. It separates believers from outsiders. Knowing the secret becomes part of who someone is. Once identity is involved, evidence becomes secondary. None of this means curiosity is wrong. Wonder drives discovery. But when curiosity hardens into certainty without evidence, it becomes belief rather than inquiry. The mashup persists because it feels meaningful, not because it is supported. Importantly, this pattern is not new. Throughout history, people have merged traditions to create larger systems of meaning. What is different now is speed. Ideas that once took centuries to spread now travel in hours. Recognizing these drivers does not require mockery or dismissal. It requires honesty. The mashup is compelling because it answers emotional questions that history does not promise to answer. History explains what happened. It does not always comfort. When these forces are acknowledged, the grip of the mashup weakens. It becomes easier to separate fascination from fact. The Watchers and the Anunnaki can be appreciated for what they are without being forced together. The persistence of the mashup is a reminder that humans do not engage with the past neutrally. We bring fear, hope, and desire with us. Ancient stories become mirrors. Understanding why the idea survives is the first step toward letting the past speak without being rewritten. A careful comparison does not begin by asking whether two traditions are the same. It begins by asking what each tradition is trying to do. Responsible comparison respects distance, difference, and purpose before looking for overlap. When that method is applied to the Watchers and the Anunnaki, the result is clarity rather than collapse. The first step is chronology. The Anunnaki appear in texts from the 3rd millennium before Christ onward. The Watchers appear in Jewish apocalyptic writings from the Second Temple period more than 1,000 years later. Time matters because ideas change. Later writers do not automatically preserve earlier meanings. Similar themes can emerge independently in different eras. The second step is genre. Mesopotamian texts involving the Anunnaki are mythic and ritual. They explain how the world is ordered and how humans relate to gods through worship and labor. Jewish texts involving the Watchers are apocalyptic and moral. They explain why evil exists and how divine justice will address it. Genre shapes meaning. Without recognizing genre, comparison becomes careless. The third step is role. What does each being do? The Anunnaki govern, judge, and authorize kingship. They maintain continuity. The Watchers observe, disobey, corrupt, and are punished. They explain disruption. Similar power does not equal similar function. The fourth step is consequence. In the Watchers' tradition, actions lead to judgment, imprisonment, and removal. In the Anunnaki tradition, actions reinforce hierarchy and persist without final reckoning. Consequence reveals worldview. One tradition defends moral law, the other organizes divine authority. Language is the fifth step. Words like heaven, God, descent, and knowledge appear in both traditions, but they do not mean the same thing. Translation requires context. Responsible comparison traces how words function within sentences, not how they sound in isolation. Influence must also be handled carefully. Cultures interacted in the ancient Near East. Ideas traveled. But influence does not equal identity. Jewish writers were aware of Mesopotamian myths, but they reshaped ideas to fit monotheistic belief. Borrowing is selective and transformative, not duplicative. A careful method also respects silence. When texts do not make a connection, that absence matters. Ancient writers did not hide obvious links. They argued openly. They named foreign gods when they meant them. The lack of direct connection between Watchers and Anunnaki is evidence, not a mystery. Modern comparison often skips these steps. It jumps to synthesis because synthesis feels satisfying. Responsible comparison resists that impulse. It allows similarities to exist without forcing conclusions. When done correctly, comparison deepens appreciation. The Watcher's story becomes a powerful moral warning shaped by historical trauma. The Anunnaki become a window into how early civilizations understood authority and survival. Both gain meaning when allowed to stand apart. This approach does not diminish wonder, it refines it. Ancient cultures were creative, thoughtful, and diverse. Treating their stories responsibly honors that diversity, rather than flattening it. A careful comparison shows that shared human concerns do not require shared beings. Fear, power, knowledge, and order appear everywhere because humans face them everywhere. Different cultures answered those concerns differently. When method replaces assumption, the question shifts. It is no longer are they the same. It becomes what can we learn from how different cultures told different truths. After examining the texts, timelines, genres, and meanings, the verdict becomes clear. The claim that the Watchers were simply the Anunnaki under a different name does not come from history. It comes from modern reinterpretation. The similarity is not found in the ancient sources themselves, but in the way modern culture rearranges them. The Watchers and the Anunnaki do not share a story. They share only broad human symbols. Heaven, power, knowledge, and judgment appear everywhere because humans everywhere ask similar questions. That overlap does not mean the answers are the same. When the full narratives are compared, the differences outweigh the similarities at every critical point. The Watchers belong to a Jewish apocalyptic framework developed during the Second Temple period. Their story exists to protect the idea of a just God in a world filled with violence and oppression. They are angels who fail, teach what they should not, and are punished. Their story ends in judgment and restraint. There is no continuation, no secret survival, and no hidden rule. The Anunnaki belong to Mesopotamian religion, stretching back to the 3rd millennium before Christ. They are gods who govern, judge, and maintain order. They are not punished for rebellion. They are not condemned for teaching. They are not removed from influence. Their presence reinforces continuity rather than explaining collapse. Historically, these traditions emerge from different pressures. Mesopotamian myth reflects societies focused on survival, hierarchy, and ritual stability. Jewish apocalyptic literature reflects communities living under foreign rule, struggling with injustice, and seeking moral explanation. These worlds produce different stories because they needed different answers. The idea that these beings are the same only appears after several modern steps. Gods are rebranded as aliens. Metaphor is reinterpreted as technology. Ancient warning becomes ancient conspiracy. At the end of this process, the Watchers are pulled in because their story sounds compatible once stripped of its moral core. This is why the claim feels ancient, but is not. It uses ancient names but modern logic. It is shaped by 20th century fears, distrust, and fascination with hidden control. It tells us more about the modern imagination than about the ancient world. History does not support the identity claim. Primary sources do not connect the Watchers and the Anunnaki. Scholarly consensus does not support the merger. The connection survives only where context is ignored. This does not mean ancient texts lack mystery or depth. They are complex precisely because they were written by real people facing real problems. Their power comes from specificity, not from being mashed together. When the Watchers are allowed to remain Watchers, their warning about power and restraint becomes sharper. When the Anunnaki are allowed to remain Anunnaki, their role in explaining authority and order becomes clearer. Neither needs to be rewritten to be meaningful. So the verdict stands. Same name? No. Same story? No. The idea that they are the same is modern, not historical. Understanding this does not end curiosity. It refines it. It shifts the question from who were they really to why do we keep reshaping them. In that shift, something important is revealed. The past does not need us to solve it. It needs us to listen carefully. The Watchers were not the Anunnaki rebranded. They were something else entirely. And in respecting that difference, we finally see both traditions more clearly.